Hi, I'm John Matthews, veteran law enforcement officer, winery owner, and your host for this podcast version of True Crime and Wine. And I'm pleased that you've joined us for this unique podcast where we feature the fascinating world of serial killers while we enjoy award winning wine. So, why serial killers and wine? Well, the answer is quite simple. Since I'm the only winemaker in the world that's captured a serial killer. And no, I didn't use wine to do it, but this is real true crime and real wine. And each episode, myself and Brandy Diamond, the popular podcast host of Texas Wine and True Crime, which, by the way, you can also hear on Spotify and all of your favorite podcast platforms, will join me. And together, we'll take you on a journey profiling some of the most interesting and intriguing serial killer cases from around the world while we enjoy some of our favorite wines. Now, I've got my favorite Cassaro wine, so pour a glass of Killer Cabernet or Murderous Merlot and join us for this podcast version of True Crime and Wine. Hey, Brandy, how are you doing today?
Hey, John, it is great to be here. Thank you so much for asking me to partner up with your podcast. I'm excited to bring some serial killer stories and really just your knowledge and my knowledge and our love of Texas wine to our listeners.
Well, and folks, let me tell you, it wasn't a very hard sell when I called Brandy and said, will you trade wine for time and we'll do a podcast together? It was simple. It was simple, right?
Yes, yes. So really glad to be here. Really glad to be partnering up, and yeah, ready to take our podcast to our listeners and some of these stories that are not only fascinating, but justice may still need to be served in some of these. So it's always important to talk about them.
Well, and that's true. We talk about many killers in this series that we are still actually tying them to murders today. The advances in DNA and genealogy, it's absolutely amazing. So if you Googled the body count of some of these killers 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's drastically different today. But let's dive into today's episode, the eyeball killer, one that obviously is intimately familiar to me. That is the serial killer that I captured in Dallas. So, Brandy, where do you think I should start?
So I think the most important thing for, especially if, people are hearing your name and seeing you and hearing me for the first time, let's talk about a little bit about your background. How did you even get involved in this case?
Well, I've spent the last 40 years in law enforcement. Matter of fact, 41 this year. I started out at the Dallas Police Department in the early 1980s, retired from Dallas in the 2000s, and moved on to work with some other agencies locally in the Dallas Fort Worth area, all the way from officer to chief of police. But for the last 30 years, my specialty has been traveling the country, working with state, local, and federal agencies on serial killers, school safety, and mass shootings. And I've been very fortunate to work on many, many federal programs, about 200 federal law enforcement initiatives, and published 7 books. So my background in law enforcement spans over 4 decades, and it's been a great career, but ups and downs. You love getting the bad guys off the street, but having to work those cases, to see those bodies, and to meet and visit with the victims, it's a little trying sometimes.
Yeah, it's tough. The eyeball killer specifically, we're in the 1980s, Harry Hines Boulevard. Tell us about the environment. What was going on at that time in the streets of Harry Hines?
Well, let me tell you, I kind of drew this short straw. You never know when you're 21, 22 years old, what turns your life is going to take. And coming out of the police academy, you're assigned to field training officers. And the training officers, their primary job is to keep you alive, right? The first speech that we always give the kids is, you went to the academy. Now you can forget that. That was from the attorneys. We're going to try to keep you alive. And those FTOs really gave you their knowledge and background of what they specialized in. And so some were specialists in drugs, and some in burglary, some in robbery, some in murder, all different backgrounds. But coming out of the academy, Brandy, not only one or two, but all three of my FTOs on days, evenings, and nights ran prostitutes on Airy Hines. That means their primary job was to manage the prostitution and the criminal events surrounding it, the robberies, the thefts, the murders, all, and the drug dealing, all that were involved with the prostitute. So it was a very, very interesting time, a very busy time in Dallas in the 1980s.
So what were those early days like? What was it like managing the girls? You started talking to people, which is really how you started getting information about the perpetrator in this case. But what were you having to do in those early days?
Well, it was make connections, and I actually took law enforcement from a little different perspective than everybody else. I graduated high school and college early. I had my degree in business administration. I went on to earn my master's in administrative management and even PhD work in organizational policy and theory. And that's not the normal path for a cop, right? And I took a more academic approach to it. So not only did I try to make a personal connection with the girls, I kept lots of notes, lots of documentation. Often I wasn't even sure of why I was writing it down, but I thought it would play a role sometime in the future and maybe solve some crimes. Now, certainly I wasn't looking 12 years in the future, but for the immediate crimes, maybe my note taking, my little different approach to law enforcement would pay off. And it ultimately did on one case when I was in the station and my chief told me, "Hey, I need you to go up on to 11,000 Harry Hines. Homicide requested you and is asking for you." And I'm like, "Why would they want me? I'm a young officer. I don't work homicide." But I drove up there and they were down in a creek, and I climbed down into the creek with them, and the investigator said, "Hey, are you Matthews?" And I said, "Yeah." They said, "We heard you really know all the prostitutes, that you've been managing them, right? Making
Yeah.
literally hundreds of arrests to try to get rid of some of the crime." And I said, "Yeah, how can I help?" And they pointed to a dead, naked, headless prostitute in the creek.
Oh,
They said, "Do you know her?"
oh
And
my gosh.
and Brandy, if it wasn't for those notes, if it wasn't for me kind of taking that more studious approach to law enforcement, not only did I know her, I know where she worked. I knew her pimp. I knew where her pimp lived. And I literally was able to give them a wealth of information within minutes. And
Wow.
would they have identified her? Sure, taken her to the morgue, done fingerprints. They would have identified her, but I sped the process up exponentially. And I was about to leave and waiting for a thank you, which never came. But then I turned around and said, "And oh, by the way, I probably know where her head is." And they said, "How could that be?" Right? "How could you know where her head is?" I said, "Because the word on the street is she's been short stopping her pimp. She's been dealing with another drug dealer. And I bet it's down here in this one section of Dallas. They drove down there. They weren't even going to stop, but their curiosity got the best out of them. They stopped. They look in the window, and what did they see? Her pimp, the guy I identified, talking to his other prostitutes and the head of the prostitute on the table." So
What?
it started, solving murders started at a very, very young age for me from a law enforcement perspective.
John, I always think there is a level of trust that they had to have in you, or at least the conversations you were having with people to disclose some of this information. How did you build that trust?
I think just talking to the girls and talking to them not like prostitutes or criminals, and let's face it, many of them had long criminal histories, robbery, theft, burglary, drug use, all kinds of things. But I guess I always saw them as people and treated them as people, and that built a connection. There's one thing about working the street, arresting somebody, throwing them into your squad car, and taking them to jail. There's another thing about just taking a second to ask them about their family. Do they have a family? Do they have children? I come from a big family. I've got lots of children, and that was always a starting point with me, and I think that might have been a little bit different than what they were used to.
You humanized them, right? You gave
Yeah.
them a name, and you made them think about where they came from, right? Which brings joy, especially if you're in a certain mindset and having to practice prostitution. All right, John. So now we're in Oak Cliff in the 1990s. What's happening in the streets of Oak Cliff in the 1990s?
Well, really, after working Harry Hines and being in law enforcement for about a decade, I went down to Oak Cliff and I thought I need a change, right? I need a break. But Oak Cliff during the 1990s, especially North Oak Cliff, was literally a shooting gallery full of gangs, drug dealing, and of course, prostitution. And I had been working on this street. I had a very small beat. Our beats were assigned because of how violent they were. And let me just give you an example, because most law enforcement, even today, unless they work the inner city, just can't even put their arms around this. In one 8-hour shift, I worked 7 individual shootings, not bodies, not murders, 7 shootings with many more bodies involved. So absolute crime ridden, area, and the gangs were prolific. It was just an incredible time. It was the peak of the crack cocaine epidemic in Dallas, and crime was rampant. Matter of fact, right now today in Dallas, they have about 275 murders on average. Back then, we exceeded 500. That's
Is
not
it?
the shootings. That's
Yeah.
not the attempted murders. That's the murders.
Is it the drugs? Is that really what was running the murder rampant at that time?
Well, certainly the crack cocaine epidemic, the Jamaican gangs, the other gangs that we had in the city. So it was almost a perfect nexus of crime, of crimes, of drugs, of prostitution. And it was just a really violent time. But, as luck would have it, I'm in the station one day, and the chief comes to me and said, I have a project for you that I want you to volunteer for. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, I know you've got a business background. I already had my consulting company at this time. He said, I know that you're used to working with the community. You're fairly high profile. I had a newspaper column I was writing. I was already doing guest appearances on Good Day Dallas on the local Fox affiliate. And he said, I'd like you to work a new project to revitalize North Oak Cliff. And I agreed. We started on the project, and our whole emphasis was to reduce crime so that we could turn the city back over to the business people so they could develop it. And if you want to know if that project worked out, 30 years ago, we planted the seeds. We dropped crime by over 70%. That's absolutely astronomical. We won a national award and an international award. And now that area, Bishop Arts District, is one of the most popular, vibrant areas in Dallas. I think you've been to Bishop Arts, Brandy.
Oh, plenty of times. And I bet our young people who go to Bishop Arts now had no idea what that area actually used to be like, or because they see it as Bishop Arts, which is totally revitalized. And yes, Oak Cliff just took a total revitalization. And I remember when you were on my show before, when we were talking about the eyeball killer, my master's degree is in economic development. And I was just fascinated that you were involved in that revitalization, but definitely gave back to the community. It is a beautiful part of Dallas. So glad to see that it have turned around.
Yeah, no, it was a great success story, and really the one that kind of, jump started my career and put it on the map. Unfortunately, in the middle of the revitalization, in the middle of cleaning up the crime, not only was I out there on the beat, but we had a serial killer.
Yes. Yes. The eyeball killer.
And yes, that is his moniker and stuff. And hey, before we get into this, I'm a little thirsty. I want a sip of wine. Let's just take a little wine break, because on each episode of True Crime and Wine, we feature one of our Cassaro Winery brands. And it's fitting to share with everyone what I'm enjoying today. I hope you can see this. It is our crime scene wine. Yes, a crime scene labeled wine. It's a dry red wine. It's a Teraldigo, which is a northern Italian varietal grown right here in Texas. It's garnet colored grape, and it's got earthy notes and flavors like blackberries, cherries, and plums. This is a medium bodied fruit that's got low tannins, and it pairs well with like spaghetti, carbonara, and it really complements the bacon and peppery notes in this wine. This is one of our most popular wines, and I'm proud to say that recently, in a huge international competition, we entered the True Crime and Wine, and it won a double gold, highest international award you can win, as well as was selected over 3,200 wineries and 24 countries. So really proud of this great true crime scene wine. I'm going to have a sip right now.
Yeah.
And each week we're going to feature one of our Cassaro wines, and we invite you to sit back, grab a glass of wine, listen to our podcast, buy some wine, listen to your favorite podcast, listen to Brandy's show. It doesn't get any better than True Crime and Wine.
Right, John. So let's get into the case. I want to start with the first victim, Mary Pratt. So we're talking December 13th, 1990. So tell us about Mary.
Well, Mary was a prostitute that worked out of the Star Motel. It's a motel located just south of the Trinity River off of I-35. And Mary was a very unassuming girl. If you had her in a room with 10 other girls and said, pick out the prostitute, you probably wouldn't have picked Mary. She was quiet. She was shy. She was born to parents that were a little elderly, so she kind of grew up as an only child. Fortunately, she got into drugs into high school. Her life spiraled out of control, and she found herself working the streets of Oak Cliff. On the night of December 13th, that morning, we found Mary a long way from where she worked. We found her about 20 minutes south of the Star Motel, south of I-20, in a very rural area of Dallas. She was shot one time in the back of the head. She was laying on the street. Her arms were posed above her head. Her shirt was pulled up, exposing her breast, and she was basically put on display for everyone to see. So we knew right from the very beginning, and the officers that responded to the crime, they knew Mary. I mean, she was fairly well known in the area of prostitutes, and when they pulled up, they said, well, we've got another dead prostitute here. And quite frankly, Brandy, if that's all it had been, I don't know if her case ever would have been solved, right? A prostitute murdered,
Yeah.
and no witnesses, no suspects, no crime scene because she was dumped there. how far is that case going to go?
Well, and I think especially when you're kind of in the drug era of things, right? And you have, nefarious. We still see it in law enforcement, John, right? When you have someone who has a different type of lifestyle, sometimes those cases aren't taken as seriously as other ones are, or they don't have, maybe there's family not missing them, or maybe they're just hard to identify. But with Mary, she's 35 years old. She's known by people in the area. Like you said, you couldn't pick her out of a lineup and think that she was probably a prostitute. And so, but what did the autopsy reveal? There's something that isn't seen at first that is then caught in that autopsy. What is that?
That's when the whole case changed, right? That's when the whole case changed. That's when my life changed. Because during the autopsy, the diener who was preparing the body for Elizabeth Peacock, the ME at the time that was on duty, ran to her and said, "My gosh, her eyes are missing." And the medical examiner said, no, let's not, go down a different route here. She was shot in the head, blunt force trauma, gunshot, or maybe even a car accident. It's very common for the eyes, which are mostly water, to be punctured and fall to the back of the head. But what did she discover when Dr. Peacock opened her eye sockets? That not only her eyes were missing, but they had been surgically removed. Now, we started researching, never in the annals of criminal history have we had a case where the eyes were surgically and precisely moved. Matter of fact, in the autopsy photos, there's almost no bruising to the face. It was done post-mortem, but it was done very, very precisely. And as you know, when you study murder, when you study serial killers, we have eyes that are cut, that are slashed, that are gouged, everything else, but never surgically removed.
I think of different cases that what makes a serial killer, right? The MO of a serial killer, especially if there's repeat behaviors, the same way they kill someone, the same way they leave them, right? These are things that you look at. So what was the MO coming with? First of all, were the eyeballs found next to the body?
Nope, the
Okay.
eyeballs were not there. And you're right. See, the MO really started from the very beginning. You're exactly right. The body wasn't dumped, right? It wasn't just thrown out on the side of the road. It was purposely placed in an area where someone would find it, and someone did when they came out to get their paper the next morning. The arms were posed over her head. Her shirt, all of that showed that this was not a random prostitute killing. So that immediately set off some alarms. But after the autopsy, when it was discovered the eyes were missing, certainly that is a very, very specific and unique signature. And quite honestly, I think that's why we still talk about the case today on podcasts, on television shows. I've done about 40 different network shows on this. We're going to do People Magazine Investigates for their 10th season next year, talking about this case still. That's how unique it is. But right from the get-go, we were pretty sure we didn't just have a murderer, but we had a serial killer.
Did police believe this had to be a doctor? Did police believe this had to be someone in the medical? Is that where minds were going? What was the kind of first thought about this when the autopsy revealed that?
Well, certainly, because the way Dr. Peacock described it to us was these eyes were surgically removed, that the person that did it had to know exactly what muscles and nerves to cut without damaging the face, the eyelids, or the eyes themselves. So right from the beginning, you are trying to think, oh my gosh, who has that knowledge that is going to be able to remove the eyes, and they're out trolling for prostitutes at night?
All right, so let's get into victim number 2, Flocka. Tell us about Flocka.
Well, Flocka, Veronica, I was back at the Star Motel. I'm interviewing the prostitutes, like I always did. What happened to Mary? When did you see her? Who saw her last? Who was she with? All the typical questions and everything. When just out of nowhere, Flocka came running up to me and said, Oh my gosh, I've got to tell you something. Now, let me kind of put this in context. Flocka was a long term, hardcore drug addict and prostitute. Often she couldn't complete a sentence. I'd ask her where her kids were, and she'd go, I don't remember. Well, where did you leave your children? Well, I don't know. Do you remember the last time you fed them? I don't know. So you've got to remember the person that we're talking about here. And now she comes running up to me and says, oh my gosh, let me tell you what happened to me. Somebody picked me up and they took me somewhere way out in the woods. And I don't know where I was. And it was just trees. And I was in a little house and they tried to kill me. And I tried to get out of the house and someone saved me. And I was able to make it out the door, and I ran through the woods. I ran through the trees. Someone followed me. They were shooting a gun. They were saying they were going to kill me. And it was wet, and I fell down. She said she found a drainage pipe. And flaca in Spanish means skinny. And she was skinny enough that it saved her life. She crawled into the drainage pipe and said at one point the killer was on top of her saying, if I find you, I'm going to kill you.
Oh
She
my gosh.
Amazing. She spent the whole night there and then at sunrise crawled out. She didn't know where she was. She was in a very rural part of Dallas, right? She heard a highway in the distance and said, I'll start hiking towards the highway and maybe catch a ride. And she gets out onto the road leading to the highway, and a white cab of an 18-wheeler comes by and stops. She flags him down. She opens the door, and what does she see? The guy from the night before.
Oh my gosh.
It wasn't the killer, though. It was the guy that, quote, saved her, that stood in the doorway just long enough that she was able to get out and to run away. So she got in the cab. He took her to McDonald's and brought her back to the Star. What a story.
Okay.
Right there.
So, okay. I'm trying to unravel a little bit of this in my head when it comes to, like you said, who's saying this to you, her background, who she is. Drugs can make our brains think very interesting things, right? You have people who might imagine something that is not there or see things that aren't real, right? But she is very clear about the story to you. I mean, did you believe her when she's sharing this with you? Did you immediately think this has to be related?
Brandy, you got to be a cop. You're so good at it. Yeah, I was one of the only ones that believed her, but everybody else kind of said what you just said. No, she's brain-addled. No, she was on drugs. She made it up. I actually called a psychologist, and I said, there is something weird about this. This lady usually has trouble completing a sentence, and she told me an involved, long, detailed story, and not only told it to me once, told it to me almost verbatim several times. She told it to homicide. She told it to FBI. Nobody believed her. And you know what he told me? There's actually a name for this, Brandy. It's called the flashbulb effect. You know how when a flashbulb goes off in your face and you kind of see that image? Apparently, she felt that she was going to be killed. And this was a prostitute that's probably been close to death dozens of times. But on this night at this time, she felt that she was going to die, and this was burned into her brain.
Well, trauma too, right?
Yep.
We know that trauma does things to our mind. I mean, we may not remember anything, but we're going to remember that moment because it's not always the action. It's really how she's feeling. Danger, death. It's imminent, right? So she's in survival mode. And that's just not something you forget.
And can you imagine laying in a drainage pipe in the mud and the dirt and your killer literally standing on top of you firing a weapon?
No. And how brave of her to come to you. I mean, how brave of her to really share that and knowing what had just happened to a fellow prostitute. Okay, John, let's get into Susan Peterson.
Yeah, so not long after I talked to Flocka, then Susan Peterson was murdered, February 10th, 1991. Susan was the exact opposite from Mary. Susan was a hardcore prostitute. She was known by everyone in the community. She carried a weapon. She was a former military veteran. If you had asked the officers at the time, if you poll all the prostitutes and pick the one that's going to survive this, who's it going to be? I guarantee almost everyone would have picked Susan. And yet she turns up to be the second victim. Susan also worked out of the Star Motel, white, female, brunette, just like Mary, 20s to 30s, worked out of the Star Motel, found 20 minutes south of there in a rural area on the same street, only a couple hundred yards from where Mary's body was found. She was posed with her arms up over her head, her shirt pulled up, her skirt pulled down. She had a single gunshot to the head, and her eyeballs were missing.
John, did they check that immediately? Was that something that they, because of where she's found, because of what had just happened, is this something they're looking for?
Well, the
Instantly.
officers on the street actually didn't, because even though she was only a few hundred yards away from Mary's body, she was across the county line. So it was not the Dallas Police Department, it was the Dallas County Sheriff's Department that responded. They had no idea about Mary. They had no way to connect the cases, but as soon as Susan's body turned up at the ME's office, they knew quickly that they had a serial killer, that it was connected.
So what happens after that? Now you have a second victim. Is all of law enforcement together now talking about this? How did the police handle this?
Everybody's talking about it. You know, it still didn't qualify technically as a serial killer because it was only 2 homicides at that point. But homicide knew it was a serial killer. We on the street knew it was a serial killer. The FBI was brought in. A task force was formed. Officers were deployed undercover, uniformed in the all of the areas where the prostitutes work, especially the Star Motel. And so there was a lot going on. The media was picking up on what was going on. Not so much about the eyeballs, but about people being killed, women being hunted down and killed and left on the street. What really fascinated me, though, was why go from Mary, kind of the low-hanging fruit, to Susan? What kind of message was the killer trying to send us?
My first thought is maybe that he's more confident than you maybe expect him to be, that he's more daring, that he's able to convince someone like Susan, to get that trust, to build that trust. And, where is he meeting them? Is he picking them up at this point, right? Are you guys thinking about all of this? Are they just victims by circumstance, or do they trust him? Is this someone they know and trust to get in his vehicle? I mean, these are the things that would be kind of running through my head.
Exactly right.
Together.
No, that's exactly what we were thinking. Is this a guy that's out there frequently? Is he a regular? Do the girls know him? Do the girls trust him? But really what struck me about the difference between Mary and Susan, because they were night and day different, I thought he was sending a message saying anybody could have killed Mary. The best could have killed Susan, and I'm the best. And so to me, that really took it to a different level. And it was also very personal to me at that point, because I had known Susan very well. I had known her pimp very well. I actually had talked to Susan. Like I said, I'd done this for years. I knew about her family. I knew where she was from. I talked to her about her dad. And so people on the street, even if you arrest them. And so I really took it personally after Susan was murdered, and everything ramped up. Brandy, what could be better than enjoying a glass of true crime and wine, branded wines, while listening to your favorite podcast like this one, or like Brandy's popular show, Texas True Crime and Wine? Well, of course, the answer is I have no idea because I love enjoying a wonderful wine with my crime. So if you'd like to sip and savor an award winning red wine as you listen to our podcast or any other, visit CassaroWines.com. CASSARO wines.com. Salute.
All right, John. So at this point, you are profiling, trying to geographically map this. Where is this guy at? Where were these girls found? Who do you need to be talking to? So you go back to the hotel, the Star Hotel, and you're talking to different girls, and you see what looks like a very familiar truck, 18-wheeler, pull up. And who was in that truck?
Yeah, in the middle of interviewing the girls, just like happened the first time, this white cab of an 18-wheeler pulls up. Wow, 18-wheeler, truck driver, prostitute motel, doesn't take a lot, right? I pull him over, and immediately out of the passenger side door flies who? Veronica. And she's waving her arms and yelling at me, "Don't arrest him, don't arrest him. This is the man that saved me." Well, oh my gosh, this now validates the entire story, right? And nobody had believed her except me. And now I have this validation. So, of course, I get him out, check his ID. He's got warrants. She's got warrants. Everybody's going to jail, right? But now I've got his name, his address. He lives at 1035 El Dorado. He's married to a lady named Dixie. 1035 El Dorado is very close to the Star Motel. But he is a small, kind of feeble-looking guy. There is no way that he could have killed Susan. But I could see that if he was simply standing almost like an obstacle in the doorway, that skinny Flocka could have fled out. But in her mind, he saved her, right? That's what allowed her to get out the door. So I'm taking him to jail. And I said, listen, Axton, if you saved her, if you saved this lady's life, all right, I can't get rid of your warrants, but I will take you to City Hall and I'll bring you to the mayor's office and I'll put you in for a medal because you saved this woman's life. And Veronica's going on and on about, yes, he did. He saved my life. And I said, what do you want? He said, take me to jail. I've never seen her before. I don't know who she is.
What?
He did not want to be associated with prostitutes. And I said, well, how did she get in your truck? And he said, I'm a good Samaritan. I was driving down the street. She flagged me down and said she needed a ride. And I'm just a really good person.
What did you do with that, John?
I took him to jail. I had no choice, right? But I had captured all of his information. And remember, I told you I was keeping notes in a little notebook in my breast pocket? Well, by this time, with Veronica's story, with Veronica and Axton's story, with the prostitute stories, my notebook had really grown into a 3-inch binder. And I thought it was time to make a visit to homicide.
So you go into homicide, you and the notebook with all of your notes. What did you tell them? What did they say to you?
I said, listen, guys, I think I'm really close. And they had heard Veronica's story, but again, wrote it off as the story of some brain-addled, drug addict prostitute, and they didn't believe it. And they kept saying, well, we can never put her on the stand. I said, it's not about prosecution at this point. We have to get a killer off the street. We'll worry about prosecution later. And I told him, I gave him the whole story with Axton, Veronica, with what I had learned from other prostitutes on the street. And I said, I think we're really close. I think this guy was working with the killer, and I think we can find him. And they said, get out of here. Go back to your beat. We're homicide. We're working the murder. We've got the FBI involved. You go back to your beat.
So wild to me, right? Like, we're all on the same team here.
That's what I thought.
You know? All right, so what happens next in this case?
Well, so now I'm really upset. And, with my shy and quiet personality, as you know, I went back to my beat, but I was really, really determined that I was going to solve this. It didn't matter what it take, nights, weekends, mornings. It didn't matter what it took. And I really felt that any other murders were kind of going to be on our head now. I mean, we were really close, and if we had worked together, I think we could have put everything together. But unfortunately, March 19th rolls around just a couple weeks after Susan. So the cycle of killing, just like we know serial killers, is getting closer and closer and closer. You know, they find that high and then they go into a depression. And the only way to find that high again is what? To kill. And so that cycle keeps getting closer. And on March 19th, Shirley Williams was found dead. But Shirley Williams wasn't a white female brunette, 20 to 30s, working at the Star Motel. She was a black female, 42. She was working at a motel on Fort Worth Avenue, and her body wasn't dumped on the country, out in the country and posed like the other two girls. It was dumped in the street in front of an elementary school for the moms and the kids to find the next morning. She was badly beaten. She had a part of a razor sticking out of her cheek. An absolutely gruesome sight. Single gunshot wound to the head, and her eyes were missing.
Was it thought that the razor blade was used to cut the eyes out and he just sort of stuck it in her face as he was leaving? What's the point of the razor blade? Just sticking out? What, did he slash her up?
Well, he beat her, he cut her. So this murder was totally different than the other ones. And what did homicide do? They called me right away and said, "See, we told you." And I went, wait a minute. So you're going to tell me just because the victimology changed, that never in the annals of criminal history have we had a killer that surgically removed the victim's eyes. But your theory is now we have two at the same time in the same city in Dallas. It made no sense. So I said, why did he treat Shirley like he did? And the only logical reason was he was in a rage. He was in an absolute rage. And as you know, the serial killers, they work themselves up, and they've got to kill. They're out there. They've got to kill that night. They've got to satisfy that urge. So then I said, what happened? What happened? Why did it change so dramatically with Shirley? So what did I do? I went back to my prostitutes. I went back to the motel, and I said, who worked with Shirley? Who knows Shirley? Who's turned tricks with Shirley? And what I discovered was another prostitute, a white female, 20s, brunette, a little overweight, same exact, right, as the first couple of victims, except she had one other feature. You want to guess what that feature was?
What?
She had a thyroid condition. And she had bulging eyes. She was the target that night. She was working in front of the prostitute motel that night. The killer drove by. He saw her. He wanted his prize, but it was raining. It was a horrible rainstorm, so he couldn't stop. So he had to go all the way up to I-30 and then back to Sylvan Boulevard and then up Fort Worth Avenue. And when he got in front of the motel, what did he find?
She's gone?
That she was gone, but he didn't recognize it because before she left, in an act of kindness, she gave her yellow raincoat to Shirley. So when Shirley got in the vehicle, he went into an absolute rage.
That is wild. He thought it was her. It wasn't her. He realized that when she got in. Oh my God. You know, isn't it wild, John? We talk about something happening and changing our projection and projected a life ahead of us. She puts on that raincoat.
Right.
And gets in the car and he thinks it's her. I mean, it's just, you know, Shirley didn't even see it coming, right?
And if Tina didn't do that act of kindness, of offering the raincoat she had been wearing, it would have been different.
That's right.
So now we have 3 victims, and I tied Tina into the case. I really felt, I still didn't have a name. I still didn't have an address. I pretty much knew exactly what happened with every single murder. So I did what we now call, there wasn't a name for it back then. We now call it geographic profiling. And geographic profiling is pretty simple. It's where is the killer's comfort zone? Where does he pick up his victims? Where does he kill his victims? Where does he drop his victims? Like the Green River Killer. His comfort zone was SeaTac, right? The Pacific Coast Highway outside of Seattle Airport. He picked up his victims. Where'd he dump them? Along the Green River. So I just knew instinctively, and again, I had all of this information in my notebook, and in those days, we had Mapscos. I don't know if anybody remembers those. They were books, right? Books that you would flip through. You would have an address. You'd have to look up the address, and it would tell you, like, A17, and you turn to page A, section 17, and it would tell you where you were going. So I took my Mapsco, and I started circling things. I started circling everything in my notebook. Where Veronica was, where the girls were picked up, where the girls were dumped, where I thought the girls might have been killed, Axton's address, addresses for the prostitute, everything. And I had all of these circles. Did I know what I was doing? Yeah, probably not. But I knew there had, from my business education, to be a nexus, right? Something that connected them all together. So I went down to Dallas County, and I had exhausted the city's computer system. And you got to remember, computers in those days aren't what they are today, right? Matter of fact, this was 7 years before the internet. I know that dates me. But you couldn't just Google, who's the serial killer on my beat. It didn't work.
That's right. Yeah.
So I had exhausted the city system. I went to the county system, and I started inputting the addresses of all of my circles.
Okay.
And I found out that one person in a county of well over 1.5 million people at that time actually owned property near those locations. Where the girls were picked up, where the girls were dumped, where I thought the girls might have been murdered. And I said, this can't be a coincidence. I get his name and everything, and I start pulling up his Social Security records and his tax records and his voting records, and I pulled up all this stuff, and I said, I got him. Until I pulled up his death certificate.
Oh, not him.
Not him, but who else could have assumed his name, his identity, his property, cashing his Social Security checks? And I pulled up his son, Charles Albright, a multi-time convicted felon who had a long criminal history, who had no real records of employment, but was obviously cash rich from his dad's money, from the rent from all of those properties. And where did he live? El Dorado. Axton wasn't married to Dixie. Axton lied to me because he used all that information to get his CDL. It was actually Charles, who was living in his dad's house, who was renting his dad's properties, who was going out in the middle of the night and servicing prostitutes, picking them up, and killing them.
So now you have a name. You don't know anything about, well, you know a background. You have a little bit of his background. And there was something about him I remember reading, John. Didn't people really like him? Wasn't he kind of a guy who tried to get, he was, seemed, I guess, kind of social, or at least to outsiders. But from what I read, he kind of got people to trust him a little bit. Like you said, no record of jobs, not really making any of his own real money, right? What kind of guy was this?
He was like, unfortunately, so many serial killers that are charming and narcissistic and have a different personality. They can kill, and then they can go play baseball with somebody. He played on a popular softball team, actually with the head medical examiner of Dallas. He did artwork. People loved him. He volunteered at church. Now, this is a guy that was convicted of sexual assault of children. And we interviewed neighbors who let him babysit their kids. And as a matter of fact, what did he do at church? He volunteered to watch the kids during Sunday school. So, yes, he was like so many of those other killers, Ted Bundy, Rodney Alcala, that had different sides to his personality and was charming and witty, and people believed him and didn't know the dark side of his personality. That's exactly right. But now I had a name, I had a mugshot, and I was on my way back to homicide.
So what happens? You go to homicide, you've got a name. Do they take you seriously now?
They still want to throw me out. And I yell and I scream and I said, no, here's the case. It's wrapped up. And it was very, very contentious. And actually, a friend of mine who worked in homicide said, hey, we'll kind of let a judge decide here. He's impartial. We have to get a search warrant anyway. We'll give him your information. And in the meantime, you go back out on the street with a photo lineup and see if any of the prostitutes recognize him. And what do you think happened?
They recognized him.
Everybody. He had been out there for years. He was cash rich and spending it on the girls, and he would pay them extra to let him beat them, let him torture them, let him tie him up, to do doubles, to do all kinds of things out there. Everybody knew him. As soon as they saw the picture, they immediately picked him out of the lineup. But what really put the icing on the cake is I talked to one prostitute who was a well-known veteran prostitute out there, and I said, do you know him? And she said, of course I do. He pays my girls well. We make lots of money off of him. And oh, by the way, a couple weeks ago, he tried to kill me. I said, what? She said, we're driving down a car. We're going down Jefferson in North Oak Cliff. And I said something. He went into a rage and he reached over and he had big, huge hands and he grabbed her by the throat and started choking her. And right before she lost consciousness, she was able to grab her mace him, and then barrel roll out of the moving car. So what do I have now?
You have an eyewitness.
Not only an eyewitness, a complainant to an attempted murder. So I go back to homicide. It's not just a search warrant we can get now. We can now get an arrest warrant. And that's exactly what we did. We got the tactical team together, and at 2 a.m, using flashbang grenades, we're able to literally blow him out of bed.
Wow.
Place him under arrest. And let me tell you, one of the most satisfying things in my career, Brandy, was when the tactical supervisors handcuffed him. They walked him out of the house. They walked him past homicide. They walked him past the FBI, and they handed him to me and said, John, this guy's yours. And I was able to put him in the back of my squad.
That's great. That's just, and it's your hard work. You know, you were working to really solve this and to bring closure. So he's arrested. You put him back in the back of the car. He's going to go to trial. You know, you've got to have some forensic evidence. So how did all this come together?
It took a fairly long time collecting the evidence. He had so many houses. We found hair and fiber evidence in his houses. We actually found some evidence that came from Shirley's raincoat that also matched evidence that was in his house, in his living room, in his vacuum cleaner where he had tried to clean it up. We found hundreds of jars of animal parts in his different storage buildings in formaldehyde. We found thousands of pictures where he would zoom in on women and take pictures of their eyes. We found a cache of weapons hidden behind the fireplace in a secret cubbyhole. He's a convicted felon. He can't have weapons. So we were flush with charges on him. The prosecutors did an absolutely amazing job bringing him to justice. And during the trial, we put up what we called a parade of prostitutes. And the girls went up there and they testified to two things. One, they're a prostitute, right? They've committed crimes. Many of them are convicted felons. They had been thieves. They had been robbers. They had been drug addicts. But they were still women that didn't deserve to die. And two, I was the only one that listened to them and to treat them like a person. And that's why they talked to me. That's why they shared the information. And it's just quite ironic, or maybe justice, that the very victims he was preying upon are the ones that put him behind bars.
Poetic justice, right?
There you go.
So let's get to the one thing we haven't closed on, which is the eyeballs. What was the fascination?
Well, apparently he had a lifelong fascination with eyeballs. In the years since, I've been able to talk to people that were friends of his that grew up with him, that said as a 14, 15-year-old, he was fascinated with eyeballs. I actually interviewed someone that was a childhood friend, played basketball with him, and he said one day he was at his house and Charles's mother was gone. It was just him and Charles. Charles had gone in another room, and he saw this jar up on this shelf, and it was way up in the air, out of the way, where it looked weird. And he's like, "Oh, is somebody trying to hide something?" And he was a basketball player. He jumped up there and grabbed it. Guess what was in the jar?
Eyeballs?
Eyeballs. So originally we were thinking that we could probably tie him to cases in other states, especially where we know he traveled and where women disappeared. But because we didn't have complainants, because we didn't have bodies, we weren't able to tie him to other cases than the murders on my beat. He was sentenced and convicted to life in prison. But now with the information I've learned in the last couple of years, I've had people saying, we heard stories of him killing people in the 1960s. So we have no idea what his total victim count could be. And we have never, ever found the eyeballs. But let me just tell you something before we close. Recently, I was interviewing some guards who were talking to him that were assigned to him over his last couple years, and he finally did admit to the murders. They asked him, "Why did you do it?" And his response was, "Some women just need to die."
So he hated women. Can we say that
women,
to torture them, right?
prostitutes.
To pay
Yep.
them to torture them, to pay them to beat them. I mean, there's a sense of pleasure in hurting women, clearly. So, and gosh, you think about who could be more of his victims. Well, if this guy was able to fly under the radar with people who actually knew him, played baseball with him, went to church with him, and he was able to fool them, how many more victims are there that he just flew under the radar?
That's right. And we'll probably never know the total number of victims. But, in closing, it was kind of a sense of justice and relief. With every case, you have highs and lows. One of my highs was going to see Mary's mom, and she wasn't able to attend the trial. And I went to her and visited her, and I said, "I just want to let you know he's convicted and he's never going to get out of prison." And she hugged me and started crying. And I said, are you okay? Is this, I know you're still upset about Mary. And she goes, "This isn't about Mary." She goes, "I'm thinking about all of those girls you saved. And thank you so much."
There were going to be future victims, John. I
Right.
mean, he wasn't going to stop.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't. Not at all. But we were able to find justice for the eyeball killer. He did spend the rest of his life in prison. He passed away a couple years ago, a lonely, convicted serial killer who was no longer able to prey on innocent women. All right, as we put a cork on this edition of the True Crime and Wine podcast, I want to thank, of course, my co-host, Brandy Diamond, for joining me on this journey.
Thank you, John. I am so happy to be on this journey with you.
Well, great. And of course, I want to thank our producer, Lauren Bedsole, back in the Corsicana Command Center for helping to make this show possible. And we'll see you on the next episode when we present A Cup of Murder. It's a chilling tale of a female serial killer whose victims willingly came to her. I'm John Matthews, veteran law enforcement officer, winery owner, and your host for True Crime and Wine. And thank you for joining us today. Salute.
Cheers.